What is the Buddhism? By Venerable Rung Ruang Papa's Sorrow, Dr. Rung Ruang Lim Chu Patipa. Life is a system of being which is composed of body and mind. How it works in everyday life is amazing. The lung and blood vessels take oxygen from air, and oxidize red blood cells to circulate to every parts of body, feeding oxygen throughout the body and clean out of waste gases like carbon dioxide. In the meantime, neurons at the central nervous system also receive stimuli from the world, and try to understand what is happening in the world as feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness, so that we can take action responding to the world rightly. Life consisting of several natural processes synchronously function in nature, and there is no any self to dictate on how it works. Without knowing these sciences of natural processes, in ancient time human took these natural processes for granted by assuming that there was a self of being. In reality, an individual life is driven by the information of individuality, karma, and functioning as a natural process under the law of cause and effect in the world. This is the fact of life. In ancient time, when most people did not have the knowledge of science, therefore whenever they saw something happening in the world, then they assumed that there was a self, and associated the world with ignorance of the truths of life within nature. At the beginning, this kind of self-assumption seems to be harmless as a self-defensive mechanism to protect an individual life. However, when the mind responds felling with craving for existence to such a self, the mind processing is rerouted into the wrong pathway of defilement. As this dysfunction of mind is aggravated into unwholesome, the whole mind processing is dominated with the cling to the five aggregates, and after then whatsoever objects of consciousness in associated with form, feeling, perception, volitional formations and consciousness are cling to such the existence of self. Therefore, the assumption of self is fundamentally the root cause of all kinds of mental problems in life. While most people turn the faith to God as a super self for refuge, but the Buddha suggested to study on the truths, and then to make use of these knowledge to make an end of suffering in life instead. In fact, what appearing to be day and night is simply the matter of the rotation of Earth around the world axis, and what appearing to be changing seasons all around a year is simply an orbital movement and position of Earth around the Sun. There is no such a creator, like God, to make days and nights and even seasons at all. The facts in science totally change the way we understand the world and life. In science, there is no the God of sun or the God of any star in space. And in fact, all beings are living under the law of nature. Science unveils the truths of nature, and by having a scientific knowledge that is based on facts and science, then we can make a real understanding in life without delusion. People can have an imagination, but the imagination must lead to the reality. Otherwise the imagination with no fact is just a delusion. The Buddha is not concerned on whether there is a God or any creator who built the world or not, but the Buddha emphasized on making study on the truths of life within nature, not mantras. Science and technology build human civilizations and change the way we lived in caves from ancient time to be where we are nowadays. At the present time, we all are live in the modern world of science and technology. The modern science reveals so many unknown subparticles and energies. We also explore further into the deeper space in universe. Scientists try to search for the identity of life in microbioorganic level, even getting deeper into subparticle world, but we find the complex entanglement of mass and energy. However, what the science and technology cannot do is the challenge of mental problem on life. The body needs nutrients in food that are used by the body to function properly and maintain health, while the mind needs knowledge to function the mind processing rightly to avoid evil doing. In Buddhism, to be a good Buddhist, the Buddha emphasized that we should not only believe in the Buddha words without questioning, but we have to study, and to investigate on the Buddha's teachings, and then carefully perform the Buddhist practice to gain insight experience, and have clear comprehending on Dharma by comparing with the Buddha's teachings with what we really experience during the practice, so that an instructed cognition is developed to gain the knowledge of the truths of life within nature, and then make the use of this knowledge for mind liberation, and this is the way to make an end of suffering in life. This is the journey of good life to be a noble person. The Buddha proposed a way to be a noble person by having a study to gain knowledge on the truths of life within nature, so-called the Enlightenment, through the threefold study strategy, namely the morality study, the mind study, and the wisdom development. Morality is the way to provide a regular basis for living with others, while the study on the mind is the path to understand the nature of life to gain wisdom for life improvement. The threefold study strategy lead the way to reach the enlightenment, and the ultimate goal of Buddhism is to make use of the wisdom to liberate the mind in order to make an end of suffering in life. The Buddhism is an innovative religion that makes a better life by searching for the truths of life within nature. Everyone can learn the Buddhism, and to investigate if the Buddhism is helpful to you or not, there is no secret in Buddhist practice. And from the scientific perspective, the Buddhism is the greatest ancient knowledge that originates the mind science to resolve all kinds of problems in life. The Buddhist studies consist of the four important discoveries as follows. Firstly, the knowledge on the truths of nature, so-called Idupakkhayata, or the law of cause and effect in nature. The nature is a huge complex system where all beings are living together. Every being makes something happening in the system, and the world is changing in accordance with their actions. When there is a process of action, then there is an associated state in the system. A particular state of the system is called a phenomenon. Everything and every phenomena that happen in the world must be explainable by certain cause and associated effect, so-called the law of nature, and these rules of engagements are called dharma. This law can be summarized into two parts. Firstly, there is nothing happening by magic or wish, but there is a certain cause that makes it happens. Therefore, there is no such a self or a super self who can create whatsoever to happen by wishes. Secondly, a certain cause will make a certain effect to happen. In fact, this cause must be explainable and repeatable so that if we makes a particular cause, then an associated effect will dependently arise. Typically, a phenomenon is a series of dependent cause and effect. In insight observation on mental phenomena, we can realize that every mental phenomenon of the object of consciousness is impermanent, deteriorating, and no self. In the age of Anthropocene epoch where human activity has changed Earth's climate and ecology, all human beings are suffering due to our own evil doing with greed, hatred, and delusion. And the only way to make an end of suffering in life is to have a good studies on the origin of problem in life, so that a proper strategy will be applied to resolve the root cause of the problem rightly. Secondly, on the day of the enlightenment of the Buddha, he discovered the special capability of mind so-called the mindfulness in the present moment. The Buddha made use of the mindfulness to study the nature of life by performing insight observation into the mind, and to explore into the detailed mind processing, so-called the process of dependent origination, which explains the mental phenomenon in terms of a series of cause and effect of life when encountering with the world. Life is an act of the stream of consciousness, by fetching a stimulus from the world, then causing the object of consciousness with the associated state of mind. These associated states of mind collectively reflect an individual mental behaviors as a person of being like you and me. As a matter of fact, what we assume as an individual being is simply the natural process of dependent origination driven by the information of individuality. And this is the reason why in Buddhism, life is no self. Thirdly, while observing the nature in each states of the process of dependent origination, then applying the Four Noble Truths analysis to analyze on the truths of life within nature, and now we can realize all the problems in life, the origin of the root causes, and the way to make an end of suffering in life. This is the preservation of truth, the core discovery of truth, the knowledge for the destruction of the taints in the process of dependent origination. The Buddha enlightenment reveals the operating system of mind as described in the process of dependent origination. The Dharma of insight wisdom, as an instructed cognition, will guide the mind processing into the right pathway for the destruction of the taints with the cessations of craving, clinging, and ignorance of the process of dependent origination. And then the mind will be disenchanted and dispassionate to the world, while all the defilements in mind processing will be abandoned, ceased, destructed, respectively, and then the mind is purified and liberated by wisdom. All beings are struggling to have good life and happiness in the world. Living in the world of uncertainty, we unavoidably encounter with so many things in the world. Some are satisfactory and beneficial to life, but some are unsatisfactory and harmful to life. We all are under the law of nature, that is, thing is happening due to certain cause and effect in nature, not by anyone's wishes. Therefore, no one can be happy all the time, but in life we have to experience both happiness and suffering, and in this situation the Buddha made use of the special condition of mind with mindful and clear comprehending to study the truths of life within nature, so-called enlightenment, and then made use of this knowledge to make an end of suffering in life. Since the external world is uncontrollable because it is contributed by actions of many people, however the internal problem is containable, and if we have good studies on the mind, then we can develop a proper strategy to resolve the mental problem rightly. Surprisingly, the suffering in life can be substantially reduced. This mind condition called the liberation. The Buddha discovered that if the mind was directed by uninstructed cognition to assume the craving for existence for self, with desire and lust, the whole mind processing would be dominated by the five aggregates subject to clinging on self with desire and lust. This was a fundamental problem that led to be unwholesome mind with greed, hatred, and delusion, and finally led to all kind of evil doing and suffering to life. In principle, the Buddhism is intended to resolve this suffering in life by searching for the truths of life within nature, Dharma. The Buddha developed the threefold study strategy to be incorporated in the Buddhist practice by performing insight observation to gain wisdom, and then utilize this wisdom to make an end of suffering in life. And the extraordinary practice is called the practice of the footprint of the Buddha, by establishing mindfulness to perform the insight observation to see what is happening during the changing of the objects of consciousness in conjunction with the five aggregates of being, namely form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness in a stream of consciousness that reflects on how life functions to respond to the world. Therefore, by establishing mindfulness whenever consciousness arises, then we will be able to be aware of the mind conditions at all times, including both the arriving stimulus from the world and how the mind is processing in responding to the world. The technique on how the Buddha performed the insight study is very remarkable technique in searching for the truths of life in nature as a pathway to enlightenment. This insight technique is based on making the use of mindfulness to observe on what is really happening in mind processing on a stream of consciousness, and each time when the mind is conscious, then making an insight observation into the mind. The fact is that if we can observe the changing of the associated state of mind in terms of the object of consciousness with respect to form, feeling, perception, and volitional formations, along with the stream of consciousness, then we can trace the cause and effect of changing states of mind in terms of the process of dependent origination. And as a result, this is the way to the Buddhist study for the enlightenment of the knowledge of the nature of life. The enlightenment is not only limited to the Buddha, but it is a main takeaway of the Buddhist study to be awakened to realize the truths of life within the nature, of which everyone can be a Buddha like the Buddha through the path of this enlightenment. Before the Buddha time, most religions were based on supernatural power and gods, but the Buddha was the first one who suggested to study for the truths of life within nature. This concept might be somehow very strange considered from the religious perspective, and even many scholars in the West consider the Buddhism as a non-religion because of no God. In fact, the Buddhism is a kind of special religion with no God. The Buddhism is based on facts and science. The Buddha discovered that life inherited a special quality of the element of acknowledgement to be aware of what was happening in the world. And for human being, we had the sixth sense basis to receive stimuli from the world. The quality of such acknowledgement to understand the reality of the world is directly related to the mindfulness development, and by establishing the mindfulness to abandon all the unwholesome thoughts of the five lower fetter, the mind could be internally steadied, composed, unified, and concentrated with clear mindful, so-called, the right concentration, to perform insight observation, to see the Dharma of what was happening inside the mind, so-called, the process of dependent origination, which is the fundamental knowledge gained in the enlightenment. And after the purified mindfulness was developed, then applied this purified mindfulness to see what was happening inside the mind when having a stream of consciousness, then we could realize the mechanism of how life functions in receiving information from the world through the sixth sense basis that the consciousness would fetch stimulus from the world one at a time, then absorb such informative stimulus by feeling. Immediately the feeling with the craving for existence would drive the mind processing in selecting the choice of action responding to the world. Typically, the stimulus from the world will activate the decision process of mind processing in terms of the reflections in the five aggregates of being, namely form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. As the object of consciousness will arise and fade away quickly, then we can realize that the object of consciousness and everything associated with it are impermanent, deteriorating, and no self. As a result, the associated form, feeling, perception, volitional formation, and consciousness are impermanent, deteriorating, and no self, as well. In fact, the arising of each mental phenomenon within the mind depends on the occurrence of previous mental phenomenon in terms of mind processing, so-called the process of dependent origination. The Buddha called the process of dependent origination as the operating system that drove how a being lived in the world in the circle of life after life. And if we can correct the problems arising in this process of dependent origination, then we can resolve all suffering in life as well. This Buddhist study in the insight reveals the reality of inside phenomena, and then activates the cognition process inside the mind to gain wisdom. The inside discovery of the process of dependent origination is the greatest knowledge of mankind because by having a good understanding of the process of dependent origination on how do we build up an island of self, myself, mind to serve the individual need which turn out to be the root cause of all kinds of mental problem or defilement inside the mind that leads to the decision in demanding to satisfy this self by taking evil actions with greed, hatred, and delusion in responding to the world. And after understanding the origin of problems, then we will be able to develop proper strategy and actions to resolve these arising problems inside the mind rightly before it may dominate the mind processing, and eventually leads to evil doing to the world of which in return for whatsoever evil doing has been done, life will directly and indirectly be in suffer. Apparently, the knowledge gained from this mind study leads to the conclusion that life is no self, and then the mind will make use of this wisdom to abandon the craving for existence, and then the craving with desire and lust will be destructed, and as a result the mind will be purified, and liberated from all kinds of suffering in life. And when saying the word, no self, it should be emphasized that it is not just the kind of belief in such a wording, but it is the real experience with clear understanding of the reality on how the mind is processing in nature that there is no self at all, and then make use of this knowledge to guide the mind to destruct desire and lust and then to guide the mind process into the right pathway, as it really should be in the Noble Eightfold Paths. All beings, no matter of who you are driven by this remarkable process of dependent origination with a specific karma of the information of individuality. Therefore by having this knowledge and then by making the right adjustment to correct the root of mind processing, and then the person can be a noble person. The origin of Buddhism started when the Buddha searching for the meaning of life while the world was covered with the darkness of delusion with tremendous supernatural beliefs. However, the Buddha made use of mindfulness to study on life to gain the knowledge on the truths of life within nature, and this the knowledge that will bring peace to mankind and the world.